There is a sentence in the Bible that should not exist. Not because it is hidden, not because it is unclear, but because if everything we think we know is true, that sentence should not be there at all. The story begins simply. Adam, Eve, two sons, Cain and Abel. That's all we are given. A beginning that feels complete, contained, understandable, and then, without warning, the story moves forward. Cain leaves, he builds, he continues, and then the line appears. Cain knew his wife. Just like that. No explanation, no introduction, no moment where the story pauses to tell us who she is or where she came from. And if you slow down just for a second, you begin to feel it. That quiet tension. Because that sentence shouldn't exist if this is the whole story. So who is she? Where did she come from? Was there more people than we were told? Or is something else happening, something deeper hidden, not in what the text says, but in what it doesn't? Because sometimes the most important part of a story is not the words on the page, it's the silence around them. And if you stay with me all the way to the end, we're going to reach a moment, a shift that may completely change how you see this story. Not by adding something new, but by seeing what was already there. So before we go further, take a second to subscribe, like the video, and if this question has ever crossed your mind, just comment one word, Genesis. Let's step back into the story slowly. Imagine standing alone in a world that has barely begun. No cities, no crowds, no history behind you. Just land, silence, and a story that feels contained. Now hold that image, because something in Genesis doesn't quite fit inside it. Cain leaves, not quietly, not peacefully. He leaves marked after the first act of violence in the story, the first fracture between brothers, the first moment something breaks that cannot be undone, and then the text says something subtle, almost easy to miss. Then Cain went away and settled. Pause there. Settled where? Into what? Because up to this point, the story feels small. Adam, Eve, two sons, a beginning we can hold in our hands. But now Cain is moving into something beyond that frame. And then another line appears. Whoever finds me will kill me. Find me who? Sit with that for a moment, because this is not a side detail. It's a fear, a real one. Cain is not afraid of emptiness. He's afraid of someone out there. But who could that be? If the story has only shown us one family who is left to find him, some readers move quickly here. They assume. They fill the gap. Maybe more children were already born. Maybe time has passed faster than it feels. And that may be true. Some traditions do suggest that Adam and Eve had many children beyond what is named. But something still feels unsettled, because the text doesn't say it. Not clearly, not directly. It lets the question hang. And that's where the crack begins to show, because now we are holding two things at once. A story that feels small in a world that suddenly feels larger. A family, and a threat beyond that family. And the text doesn't pause to explain, it moves forward, as if we're already supposed to understand. But what if we don't? What if we're reading this as if it were written for us in the way we expect stories to work? Clear, complete, fully explained. But ancient texts don't always do that. Some scholars have pointed out that early narratives often assume knowledge instead of building it step by step. They don't slow down for every detail. They move and expect you to move with them. But here's the tension. If the text assumes something we don't see, then what are we missing? Because Cain is not just leaving, he is entering a space where he can be found, where he can be threatened, where he is no longer alone. And yet we were never shown that world. So now the question shifts. Not just where did his wife come from, but something deeper, something quieter. What kind of world was already there before the story chose to show it? And why does Genesis let us feel it without ever fully revealing it? Because if this is where the story begins to open, then maybe what we're seeing is not a mistake, but the first sign that the story is larger than it first appears. And if that's true, then the next detail becomes even harder to ignore, because Cain doesn't just survive, he builds, and what he builds changes everything. What if the answer has been there all along? Not hidden, not lost, just easy to overlook. There is a line in Genesis that many readers pass quickly, almost without noticing. He had other sons and daughters. That's it, one sentence. And for many, that feels like enough. Because if Adam and Eve had more children, then the world could grow, families could expand, generations could begin. And Cain's wife? She could come from that same line, a sister, or perhaps a niece, someone within the same family. Some traditions have read it this way, quietly, simply, no mystery, and at first that explanation seems to settle everything, but only at first, because something doesn't quite rest, not fully. Yes, the family grows. Yes, more people exist. But the story still feels ahead of itself, because then we read this. Cain built a city. Pause there. Let that image form. Not a shelter, not a small dwelling. A city. And suddenly, the scale changes. Because a city means more than people. It means structure, order, relationships, movement, conflict. It means systems forming, lives intersecting, something already in motion. And that's where the tension returns. Because this is not just a growing family anymore. This feels like a world. So we step back and ask again, how many people would it take to build something like that? Not just physically, but socially. A city suggests roles, differences, a sense of belonging and separation. And yet the story never shows us that process. It doesn't describe the growth. It doesn't map the expansion. It simply moves there, as if we're expected to follow. But what if we can't? What if we're trying to fill in the gaps with assumptions that feel logical, but don't fully match the weight of what's described? Some readers are comfortable here. They see time passing, many years, many generations, and that may be part of it. But even then, something feels compressed, almost like the story is skipping steps, moving from a small beginning to a structured world, without showing us how it got there. And that feeling, that quiet sense of something missing, doesn't come from doubt, it comes from attention. Because when you slow down, the details begin to stretch, and what once felt simple starts to feel layered. Maybe the family explanation is true. Maybe Cain's wife did come from that line. But that doesn't fully explain the world he walks into, because Cain is not just surviving, he is building, participating, continuing something larger than himself. And here's where the question deepens. What kind of world allows that this early in the story? Not just biologically, but structurally. Because building a city is not the beginning of human life. It's a sign that something has already begun, and we weren't shown it. So now we're holding two ideas again, a growing family and a world that feels already formed, and they don't quite sit together, unless the story is doing something else. Not ignoring the details, not forgetting them, but choosing not to focus on them. And if that's true, then maybe the question isn't where did Cain's wife come from? Maybe the deeper question is, why does the story move forward as if the world is already there? Because if we keep following this thread, the next layer doesn't just add information, it changes how we understand what Genesis is trying to do. And that's where another tradition quietly steps in. What if the silence wasn't empty? What if it was remembered somewhere else? Imagine a story told more than once, not rewritten, not changed, but carried through different communities, each one preserving something slightly different. Because when we reach this moment, this question about Cain's wife, some traditions don't stay silent. They answer. One of those comes from an ancient text called Jubilees, a text preserved carefully within the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. And in that telling, Cain's wife has a name, Awan, a daughter of Adam and Eve. Simple, direct, no mystery. At first it feels relieving, because now the gap is filled. The silence has a voice. But we should pause here. Slow down. Because not all traditions treat Jubilees the same way. Most Jewish and Christian traditions do not consider it scripture, while the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has preserved it differently. And that matters, because it reminds us we are not dealing with one single stream, but with a family of traditions. Some emphasize what Genesis says, others preserve what Genesis leaves unsaid, and neither approach is trying to deceive. They are remembering differently. Some scholars have pointed out that ancient communities often carried parallel versions of the same story, not in conflict, but in layers. And that opens a different possibility. What if Jubilees is not adding something new, but preserving something that Genesis chose not to include? Not because it was unimportant, but because it wasn't the focus. And that shifts the feeling. Because now the question is no longer, is Awan real, but something quieter? Why does Genesis remain silent where another tradition speaks? And that silence begins to feel intentional. Not a mistake, not an oversight, a choice. Because even with Awan, even with a name, something still lingers. The deeper tension we felt earlier doesn't disappear. The world still feels larger than the story shows. The city still stands. The fear still echoes. So even when one question is answered, another remains. What kind of story chooses to leave that space open? Some readers find comfort in having a name, Awan, a clear line, a complete explanation. And that is one way to read it. But others notice something else, that even when details are added, the shape of the story doesn't change. It still moves quickly. It still assumes. It still leaves space. And maybe that space is not something to eliminate, but something to notice. Because sometimes what a story does not say tells you where to look. And that can feel unsettling. Because we are used to clarity. We want every piece in place, every question answered, but ancient texts don't always work that way. They don't close every gap, they leave room. And maybe that room is where the meaning begins. So now we're standing between two ways of seeing, one that fills the silence, and one that leaves it, and neither one feels complete on its own, unless the point was never to remove the silence, but to understand why it was there in the first place. Because if a name like Awan was remembered, then Genesis made a decision to not include it. And that decision might matter more than the answer itself. So now the question shifts again. Not just, who was Cain's wife? But, what is Genesis choosing to show us instead? Because if we follow that question, we're about to step into something deeper. Not a missing detail, but a world already beginning to take shape just outside the frame. What does it take to build a city? Not just hands, not just time, but people. Many people. Hold that image again. Not a single family. Not a small group trying to survive. A city. Because Genesis says it simply. He built a city and called it after his son. No explanation. No transition. Just a city. And something about that should slow us down. Because cities don't appear at the beginning of a story. They appear after something has grown. After lives have multiplied. After systems begin to form. So we pause again. What kind of world does Cain step into? Because he is no longer wandering. He is building, settling, naming. And naming matters. To name something is to claim it, to shape it, to say, this is where life continues. But here's where the tension deepens. Because we were never shown that world forming. We saw a garden, we saw a family, we saw a fracture. And suddenly we see a city. Something is happening between those moments. But the text doesn't follow it. It lets us feel it. And maybe that's intentional. Some readers suggest that Genesis is not trying to document every step, but to highlight turning points, moments where something shifts. And this feels like one of them, because Cain is not just building structures, he is participating in the formation of human life outside the garden. A life marked by distance, by effort, by survival, and something else begins to emerge. Community. Not the kind we imagine easily, but something raw, unstable, still forming, because this is not a peaceful beginning. This is a world that has already known violence. The first death, the first fear, the first separation, and now that world continues, not by stopping, but by expanding. And that's where it becomes personal. Because the first city is not built in innocence. It is built after something breaks, after a brother falls, after trust is lost, and yet life continues. That tension matters, because it tells us something about the kind of world Genesis is showing. Not perfect, not untouched, but already changing. and Cain is inside that change, not outside it. Some interpretations suggest this moment marks the beginning of human culture, not just survival, but structure, identity, memory, and that changes how we read the story. Because now we are not just asking where people came from, we are asking what kind of world they were becoming. And that world feels familiar, because it carries the same tension we still feel today, building after breaking, creating after loss, continuing even when something has already gone wrong. And maybe that's the point, not to show us every detail, but to show us the kind of world we recognize, a world that grows even when it's wounded. But here's the question that still lingers. Why doesn't Genesis show us that world directly? Why let us feel its presence without ever fully revealing it? Because if the city is already there, then maybe the story is not about how the world began, but about what it became. And if that's true, then we may have been asking the wrong question all along. Not where did she come from, but something deeper. What is this story actually trying to show us? What if we've been asking the wrong question? Not a bad question, not an unreasonable one, but the wrong one. Because everything we've followed so far leads us here, to this quiet tension, this feeling that something is missing, and the natural response is simple. We try to fill it. We ask, where did she come from? Who were these people? How did the world grow so fast? And those are fair questions, honest ones. But what if the story was never trying to answer them? Pause there. Because that possibility changes everything. Some scholars have suggested that Genesis does not function like a modern history book. Not incomplete, not careless, but focused on meaning more than detail. John Walton, for example, has explored how ancient texts often describe purpose and function rather than giving a full account of material origins. Not everyone agrees with this, and that's important. There are different ways to read Genesis, different traditions, different lenses, but many share one observation. Ancient storytelling does not always explain everything, and that brings us back to the silence. Because maybe that silence is not something to fix. Maybe it's something to understand. And here's where the shift begins. What if Genesis is not leaving something out, but leaving something open? Not because it forgot, but because it is pointing us in a different direction. Because notice what the text does show. It shows a brother killing a brother. It shows fear entering the world. It shows exile. And then it shows building, a city, a continuation of life after something has broken. That progression feels intentional, not random, not incomplete. And suddenly the question starts to change. Not, why doesn't the text explain more, but what is the text choosing to focus on? Because if the focus is not on every person, then maybe it's on something else. Something deeper. Something that moves through the story without needing every detail. And here is the moment where it turns. The silence is not a flaw, it's the design. Let that sit for a second. Because that idea can feel uncomfortable. We are used to clarity. We want full explanations, clean timelines, everything accounted for. But this story doesn't give us that. And maybe it's not supposed to, because we are reading it with modern expectations. We ask questions the original audience may not have asked. We expect answers they may not have needed. And that creates a gap, not in the text, but between the text and us. And that realization can feel almost personal, because it means the tension we feel is not just in the story. It's in the way we are trying to understand it. And that changes how we read everything. Because now, instead of forcing answers, we begin to notice patterns, what the story highlights, what it repeats, what it moves past without stopping, and one pattern stands out. The story is not tracking every human detail. It is tracking something else, something that begins in a garden and continues outside it, something that changes how people relate to each other, to the world, to themselves, and suddenly, the missing detail feels less central. Not irrelevant, but not the point. And that realization creates a different kind of question. Not, who was Cain's wife? But, what is this story actually trying to show us? Because if the silence is intentional, then the meaning is not hidden in what's missing. It's revealed in what remains. And if we follow that, we may begin to see why Genesis feels incomplete even when it isn't. Why does this story feel unfinished? Not broken, not confusing, just incomplete. You can feel it, can't you? That quiet tension, like something important is just outside the frame. We've followed the story carefully. We've stayed with every line, every shift. And still there are gaps. People not introduced, moments not explained, a world that seems to expand without warning. And the instinct is natural. We want to fix it. We want to fill in the missing pieces, make it whole, make it make sense. But what if that feeling is not a problem? What if it's the signal? Because some readers have noticed that ancient texts do not always aim for completeness, not in the way we expect. They don't explain everything. They don't map every detail. They assume. They assume the listener knows more. They assume the story is shared, and they focus only on what matters most. But here's where it gets difficult. We are not those listeners. We are reading this thousands of years later, from a different world, with different expectations. We want clarity, precision, a full account, and when we don't get it, we feel the gap. But what if the gap was never meant to be filled? Some scholars suggest that Genesis reflects an ancient way of telling truth, not by listing everything, but by selecting, choosing what to show, what to leave unsaid. And that selection is where meaning lives, because what a story leaves out can be just as important as what it includes. And that changes the way we read, because now the question is not what's missing, but what is being emphasized, and suddenly the story becomes clearer, not in detail, but in direction. Because Genesis keeps returning to the same movements: creation, choice, consequence, and then continuation. Life doesn't stop, even after something breaks. And maybe that's why so much is left unspoken, because the story is not about every person. It's about the pattern, the movement of the human story itself. And here's where it becomes personal, because we live the same tension. We don't see everything. We don't understand everything. There are gaps in our own lives, moments that don't connect, questions that remain unanswered, and yet we continue. We build. We move forward. We make meaning without having the full picture. Just like Cain. And maybe that's why this story feels so close. Not because it explains everything, but because it doesn't. Because it reflects what it feels like to live inside a story you don't fully understand. And that realization shifts something. The gap is no longer frustrating. It becomes familiar, because it's not just in the text. It's in us, the way we search, the way we question, the way we try to connect what doesn't fully connect. And maybe that's where the story is actually speaking, not in the answers, but in the tension. So now the question changes again. If Genesis is not trying to complete the story, then what is it trying to reveal? Because if we follow that question, we're about to reach the point where everything reframes, and one sentence will no longer mean what we thought it did. What if we've been looking in the wrong place? Not carelessly, not ignorantly, just instinctively, because from the beginning, our eyes went to the same question. Who is she? Where did she come from? We searched for a missing person, and that makes sense. That's how we read stories. We look for characters, origins, explanations, but slowly something has been shifting. The story hasn't followed that question. It hasn't stopped to answer it. It hasn't tried to resolve it, and that should make us pause. Because if something matters, the story usually tells us. But here it doesn't, and that silence begins to feel different. Not like something forgotten, like something redirected. So we step back, just a little, and we ask a different question. Not who is missing, but what is being shown. Because when we do that, a pattern begins to appear. The story opens with life, then choice, then fracture. A brother falls. A line is crossed. Something breaks that cannot be undone. And then something unexpected happens. The story doesn't stop. It continues. Cain leaves. He fears. He builds. And suddenly we are no longer in a garden. We are in a world. A world where people live, work, build, fear each other. And something begins to spread. Not just life, but consequence. The weight of that first moment moving outward, into relationships, into communities, into everything that follows. And that's when it becomes clear. We've been searching for a missing person, but the story was never about a missing person. Pause. Let that settle, because this is the shift, the one everything has been pointing toward. Cain's wife was never the mystery. It feels strange to say that, after everything we've followed, every question we've asked. But listen again to what the story shows. It doesn't explain her, but it shows us something else. It shows us what kind of world Cain enters. A world already forming, already changing, already carrying the weight of what has happened. And that changes how we see everything, because now the focus moves from origin to outcome, from missing details to visible consequences. And suddenly, the story feels closer, not distant, not ancient, familiar, because we recognize that world. A world where things break and still continue, where people build even after loss, where life moves forward without full understanding. And maybe that's why the story doesn't explain everything, because it's not trying to satisfy curiosity, it's trying to show reality. Not every detail, but the moment. Everything begins to change, and that realization lands differently, because now we are not just observers, we are inside the pattern, living in a world that still carries that same tension, still building, still searching, still asking questions that don't always resolve. And maybe that's the point, not to give us every answer, but to show us where we stand in the story. And now when we return to that sentence, Cain knew his wife, it no longer feels like a problem. It feels like a doorway, a quiet invitation to look beyond the detail and see the world behind it. But if that world was already there, if the story begins in the middle of something already unfolding, then one question still remains, a deeper one. What if this wasn't the beginning at all? So we return to the question, the same one we started with, quiet, simple, unresolved. Where did Cain's wife come from? At first, it felt like a problem, a gap, something missing. But now, after everything we've seen, it feels different, not smaller, but wider, because there isn't just one answer. Some traditions suggest she came from Adam's family, a sister, a close relative. That is one way to read it, a grounded one. Other traditions, like those preserved in texts such as Jubilees, give her a name, Awan, a remembered detail, carried through a different stream, and in that telling, the silence is filled. But even then, the deeper tension remains, because no matter which path we take, the story still moves the same way. It still focuses on something beyond the detail. And that's where we slow down again, because it would be easy to try to settle this completely, to choose one answer, to close the question. But maybe that's not what the text invites us to do. Some readers are comfortable holding one explanation, others leave the space open, and both approaches exist within the wider conversation. Because Genesis does something unusual. It leaves room, not confusion, not contradiction, but space. Space for different traditions, different emphases, different ways of remembering, and that space is part of the story, because it forces us to sit with something we don't fully control. Not every detail is given. Not every answer is fixed, and that can feel uncomfortable. But it can also feel honest, because that's how life feels too. We don't see everything. We don't understand everything. And yet we keep moving forward, just like the story does. And maybe that's why this question stays with us. Not because it lacks an answer, but because it opens something deeper. A way of reading, a way of seeing. Because once you notice the silence, you start to notice it everywhere. In the gaps, in the transitions, in the places the story moves past quickly, and you begin to ask different questions. Not just, what is missing? But, what is being shown? And that shift changes everything, because now Genesis no longer feels incomplete. It feels intentional, focused, telling one part of a larger story, and that story doesn't begin where we thought it did. So before we close, pause for just a moment. If this changed how you see the story even slightly, comment just a few words. I see it now. Because sometimes, The smallest shift in perspective changes everything. And if you've been following this journey, take a second to subscribe, like the video, so you don't miss what comes next. Because this question doesn't end here. It leads somewhere else, somewhere deeper. Because if Cain didn't walk into an empty world, then maybe the story didn't begin with him. Maybe it didn't even begin with Adam. And that's where the next question begins. Not everyone agrees with it. Some strongly reject it. But others have been asking it for a long time. What if there were people before Adam? And if that question exists, then we may have been reading the beginning as if it were the start, when it might be something else entirely. Something already in motion. We'll explore that next.